We've all been proud of Kim Davis, a Kentucky clerk who stood up against the Supreme Court's rule there to issue, yeah, we've been proud of her. Being civil disobedient is my topic tonight. I'm going to talk about should we become disobedient to our government? When should we stand up for what it's worth, for what we believe? I need to talk to you tonight about when we do stand up and disobey civilly, that we will be open to the government's rules and laws. So when we stand up and for our rights, we will have to pay some penalties. But let's talk about that in depth. I'm going to be in the 13th chapter of Romans tonight, if you would like to follow me there. Romans chapter 13. Sunday morning, I'm going to go to Romans 12, and then I want to finish up the Romans 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16, because these chapters are a really tremendous application of our Christian faith. How do we live? How do we make it work? How do we when the nitty-gritty gets gritty, where does the rubber meet the road? I'm using a lot of throwaway statements there, but to let you know what we're talking about. So Romans chapter 13 is where we're going to be tonight. I'm going to sort of do it out of order, but I wanted to start here tonight. Folks, it's been reported that 28,000 pastors have already been recruited to assist the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA if martial law is ever enacted. These pastors have already been found and are being trained to work with our government during difficult times, to work with our government if and when martial law was ever declared. Now, let me tell you what they're teaching, what the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, they're teaching these pastors, and by the way, I want you to know, your pastor is not one of them. Okay, I will not be one of them, and never will be one of them. But let me tell you what they're teaching these pastors to teach the people, and that is Romans chapter 13. Now, when we read chapter 13 tonight, if you took this and out of context, if you didn't understand how to interpret this, you would understand why that the government is wanting this taught to people, because this is what happened when Hitler was taking over in Germany. All the pastors in Germany were encouraged to preach Romans chapter 13, to preach that to the churches. Because what it says is, what it seems to say on the surface is that anything the government does is fine because God could have put them in power. All right, now we have to be careful, because as what you're going to see tonight when we go through this, that leaves a huge hole in a lot of our theology and a lot of our belief. So turn to Romans 13 right now, and I'm going to try to preach from it. Do you know what martial law is? Are you familiar with the concept of martial law? That is when the Army, our United States Army, becomes the police, and our Army moves on the population of us, and then manages us like a police force, and there'll be all kinds of curfews and those sorts of things. But martial law is simply in times of national disaster or some other kind of event where the population becomes uncontrollable, the U.S. Army will be brought in to quell the rioting and the chaos. And that makes sense. It sounds good when you think about that. But quite honestly, in my opinion, now this is just me, I think that anytime we use our Army to police Americans, that to me is an illegal act. It goes against everything we believe in as free, loving Americans. It's when our Army will stand up and try to become our police force. There's a term I want to teach you. It's called posse comitatus. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. It is a term, it was an act that the United States federal law was signed into law on June the 18th, 1878 by President Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, the purpose of the posse comitatus was to act as to limit the powers of the federal government, to limit those powers in using military personnel to act against domestic law enforcement, to act as domestic law enforcement personnel. In other words, in 1878, Rutherford B. Hayes signed into law, you can't use the Army to control the American population. 1978. That's called Posse Comitatus, is the law that went by. Well, that served us well from 1878 until President George W. Bush signed into law a law that gives the President of the United States the power in the event of any disaster, accident, or catastrophe that he deems to require it to involuntarily take, now get this, National Guard troops from State A and require them to work in State B for up to a year in law enforcement rather than just trust traditional areas like disaster relief over the objection, now get this, over the objection of both state governors. So what George Bush signed into law in 2011 was that anytime he wants to use the Army, or the President wants to use the Army, he can use it, and without the approval of the states. Now that's law. You're living under that law. Anytime the President wants to, he can activate National Guards. Let's say he can activate Missouri National Guard to go police Texas. And he doesn't have to have the approval of Texas or of Missouri to do that. That's the law we live under right now. It's getting worse. I'll tell you, it's even getting worse. I want to also tell you that our Civil War, why do you think we fought a Civil War? It was slavery, right? No, it wasn't over slavery. Is that a shock to you? Our Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. It was fought over states' rights. That was the issue. Now, of course, slavery was what states' right was about. Some states wanted to have slavery, some didn't. But it boiled down to states' rights. And so the Civil War was fought to keep states having the right to manage themselves. Now, on December the 31st, 2011, President Obama signed the National Defense Authorization Act into law, which contains a measure that allows U.S. citizens to be taken into custody and held indefinitely without ever being charged with a crime. That's the law we live under. Are you aware of that?
We are now.
We don't have to be just charged with a crime. You don't have to be guilty. I mean, you look like you did something wrong. Okay, we got you. Now, why would you be concerned about that? Now, that makes sense if this is only for bad people, right? I can see, if we have the rioting here or something, I can see how we would need to have some steps to take us further. But guess who the new threat is to national security?
Us.
We are. Conservative Christians and constitutionalists. Are you aware? Do you see where I'm going to go with this tonight? I hope that you have become very much awake and alert to what I'm telling you tonight, because we no longer live in a free country. If anybody says America is a free country, it isn't any longer. And I'm sorry about that. While we were not looking, our national leaders have moved against the people of America, and they've made it legal. Now see, this is not just a Democrat problem or a Republican problem. This is not a present president problem or a former president problem, but it's a massive, big thing that it's been coming on through Republicans and Democrats. So we are now in that process. What happened to America? Again, I repeat to you, we seem to be playing from Hitler's playbook. This is exactly what they did in Nazi Germany prior to World War II. These steps are being taken right on down. Now, turn to Romans chapter 13. Now, this is where the nitty's going to get gritty. Now, tonight, I'm not going to tell you what you need to do. I'm not going to tell you that you need to resist the government or whatever. I'm just going to lay out for you a theology of how we live as Christians in any kind of government. Let's come through this now. When Paul wrote the book of Romans, he wrote it during the time when Nero was the Caesar in Rome. Can anybody remember what Nero was like? He was a a no good, low down snake. Yeah, he was horrible. He was homosexual. He was a child pedophile. I mean, there is nothing this man valued or honored, and he was the leader of Rome, the world's leading government. So he was in power when Paul wrote Romans 13 and the whole book of Romans. And so, as I said earlier, Hitler used the pastors in Germany to teach this to churchgoers, in which it says, if you read it on its face value, without understanding the context or interpreting it, it will tell you if the government says it's okay, it's okay. Or if whatever the government does is okay. And you and I both know that simply isn't true. I believe it is wrong to blindly follow any government decree that goes against the Word of God.
Yes.
Amen? It's wrong. I don't care who says it's right. If God says it's wrong, it's wrong. And I commend these folks in our country who are standing up, the people that wouldn't bake the cake for the gay couple's wedding because it violated their conscience. And, you know, again, I don't want to get into that, but I mean, we're moving into a time when civil disobedience among Christians will become more and more normal. It's going to come. If we don't do something and stand up, we'll be blown out of the water. So it's going to be time. We're going to have to stand up for what we believe. So what is a Christian's responsibility to the government? What is it that we have? All right, let's see what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 13. The same text that Hitler required taught in Germany, and that FEMA is requiring these 28,000 pastors to get ready to preach to the folks in the FEMA camps and other places. Here's what they're going to be taught. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Now, let me just start out by saying, in a perfect world, in a normal situation, we are to do everything we can to be in subjection to our government. We are to be loyal citizens of our country. We're to support our governments, our governors and our legislators and our Supreme Court. We are to support them, and we're to pray for them. Now, so that's in a perfect world. But we're going to talk about tonight what happens when we can no longer do that. But it says, Paul told them, we are to be in submission to these authorities because, here's his logic, he says, because they are appointed by God. God put them in place. Now, it sounds like that's saying that God put them in place, and they're, no matter what they are, God's using them. And again, we're in such a delicate area here. I want to make sure that you understand, first of all, that governments are there for our good, and we are to support good government. So Paul lays out his instruction concerning his authority. He says, all authority is from God. And I believe all authority is from God. Therefore, if anyone resists that authority, he's resisting God, it says in verse 2. And resisting a government will put you in conflict with the law of that government. And you need to know that. The lady that wouldn't give the marriage license, she went to jail because she stepped across, I believe, an invalid law. It was a law passed by our Supreme Court that didn't go through government, that didn't go through the Congress or the representatives of the Senate. It didn't go through any of those people. Just our Supreme Court, by declaration and fiat, made it a law. By the way, that's illegal.
Yes, amen. Right.
Okay. Augustine was one of the early Christian thinkers. And Augustine said that government is a necessary evil, and that it is necessary because of evil. I like that. Government is a necessary evil, and it's necessary because of evil. That was very, very well said. The function of government is to restrain evil and to maintain, uphold, and protect the sanctity of life and property. That's the purpose of government. It's to resist evil, maintain and uphold and protect the sanctity of life and property. And what Paul meant was, when a government is doing that, when any government is doing that. It's restraining evil and upholding and protecting the sanctity of life and property. When any government is doing that, Paul says we're to submit to that, and I agree with him because that's what really is the best for us all. But when a government performs these duties that are exactly opposite to what God has put in place, what are we to do? What are we to do? I know what I'm going to do. I have a higher authority than our government, and I'm going to. That's the government. That's the authority I'm going to submit to and follow, even if our government says that I'm not to. So our basic posture toward government, according to the New Testament, is to be submissive and obedient citizens of the state. Now, let's keep going. Verse 3. Now, before we read verse 3, let me tell you that the real problem is not all governments are a terror to evil. Not all governments are a terror to evil, as they should be. And some governments even are against the good works of Christianity. Let's keep reading and then you'll follow me along here. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. That's what Paul said. That's what he thought. He couldn't imagine that a ruler wasn't. He thought all rulers were good. Keep reading. Do you want to be unafraid of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise for the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister to avenge, to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Now, friends, good government encourages good works and not evil. That's what good government does. It encourages the good things that we do. It encourages life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It encourages those good things that we've been built, our nation's been built upon. But what happens when a Christian good is called bad? What happens when the whole world is reversed and what we thought of was right is now being called wrong? What are we to do when our government perverts ancient truths of the Bible that involves itself in detestable practices like child sacrifice and the destruction of the marriage of marriages, child sacrifice, abortion, and then a gay right, changing the rules on marriage. Okay, what do you do if or when a government requires you as a Christian to do what God forbids, or forbids us to do what God commands? Then we have a government that is opposed to God. Are you with me? We have a government that is opposed to God. And when the government is no longer acting justly and no longer protecting life, sanctioning abortions, for example, then it is the task of the church to be the prophetic voice, to call the state to task, and to tell the state to repent and do what God commands it to do. It's our job to stand up and speak. We stand up and we vote. We stand up and we write our congressmen, our senators. We do what we do as American citizens. It's time for us to stand up and not just sit back and let somebody else do it. When a government, for instance, the Supreme Court, decrees this ancient law of marriage between a man and a woman is no longer valid, listen, I'm telling you, we have a government that God cannot bless.
That's right.
I've told you the other day, I think we're strike 3. We're out. I think we've struck out 3 times. And we're moving under the judgment of God. We've taken God out of our schools. We've voted in abortion and same-sex marriage, strike 1, strike 2, strike 3. I think you get where I'm going here. Now, let's look at verse 5. Because this is where this must turn. Above all else, we must follow our conscience. We must follow our conscience. Now let's read it. Therefore, you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For conscience sake. Let me lay some things out for you. If I talk about civil disobedience as a pastor, I know there are people here going to look at me like, are you crazy? You rebel. There's nobody, okay, what is wrong with you? Well, the same thing is wrong with me that was wrong with the Egyptian, the Hebrew ladies when Pharaoh told him to kill all the babies. And Moses' mother said no. We're going to put him in a basket. She was civilly disobedient. And look what that turned out. How that blessed us. Moses, she feared God more than she feared the king of Egypt. And she let the boys live. Well, she wasn't alone. Daniel records a number of civil disobedient acts. Nebuchadnezzar told him not to pray, and he went ahead and prayed 3 times a day. They told Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, boys, you're going to bow down to this statue out here that's a model of our king. You're going to bow down to him or you're going to die. They said, sir, you do what you've got to do. We're not going to bow down to that idol. Now, I'm not going to preach that sermon, but they were civilly disobedient to the king. And you all know what God did. Now, in the New Testament, Peter and John were also civilly disobedient. And they were to the authorities at the time. Peter healed a man born lame, and Peter and John were arrested for preaching about Jesus, and they were put in jail. Peter said, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge. For we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and what we've heard. In other words, you can do what you got to do. We're going to tell you about Jesus. Yes. We've seen, we've heard. Oh, yeah. Well, Peter also said something like that in Acts 5. The rulers confronted the Apostle Peter and just told him, don't you preach about Jesus anymore. You just shut up about it. And he said this, we must obey God rather than men. Yeah. Amen. Now later the rulers they went on, and there was other things. And even when we get down to the book of Revelation, where we've been walking around for a long time in the book of Revelation, the Antichrist is going to be the government. He's going to be the authorities. And if you follow the authorities at that point, when it becomes the Antichrist, and you do everything he says, your soul will be sent to hell. Yeah. You're going to have to be disobedient and not take the mark of the beast. You're going to have to stand for your faith. It's going to be very, very difficult. In Revelation 13, 15, talks about what you're going to have to do. Now here's what you need to know. Here's where we're getting to with this. And I'm just getting started tonight. I'm going to pick up again, as I said, and walk through this whole Romans thing, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Christians should resist a government that commands or compels evil and should work non-violently within the laws of the land to change a government that permits evil. We need to act non-violently, but act to change our government. There may be a day coming when I say, okay, maybe down at the courthouse Monday morning, bring clothes and pack, because we'll probably spend a few days in jail. When that happens, what are you going to do? Let me ask you a harder question. What are you going to do when the government comes and says, Cowboy Church, all your tithes and offerings that you give there no longer will be tax exempt? You can give it to the Cowboy Church all you want to, but you can't take it off your income tax anymore. What are you going to do then?
Continue to give it to.
Got some hard questions coming, folks. What do you believe in? What are you going to stand for? Now, they would go ahead and let us be tax exempt if I preach what they want me to preach. If I would, preach Romans 13 like the German pastors did. I'm not going to do that. So, civil disobedience is permitted when the government or laws, commands are in direct violation of God's laws and commands. Now, if a Christian disobeys an evil government, unless he can flee from the government, he should accept the government's punishment for his actions. I'm just telling you, if you act civilly disobedient, you will be punished. And you need to be willing to accept that before you go into it. Are you with me? Okay. Christians are permitted to work to install, by the way, we can install new government leaders within the laws that have been established. We can change things, and we can make things differently. Yeah. We are commanded to pray for our leaders and for God to intervene in His time to change any ungodly path that they are pursuing. Are you praying for our governor? Are you praying for our Congress? Are you praying for our Republicans and our Democrats? Are you praying for our president? Are you praying for our Secretary of State? Are you praying for him? Have you given up? Listen, it's time for us to get on our knees and pray. Amen. This is the time to pray. If you don't like what's going on, then ask God to change it. Be willing to stand up. We are commanded to pray. He says, 1 Timothy says, First of all, then, I urge you and urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgiving be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who live in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. I'm going to close tonight with a statement from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I don't know if you've ever read any of his work. He is a Russian, and he has written some great work. And he said these words: "We should have resisted the KGB at the front door. If the KGB thought that they might not go home that night, the Russian people might have had a different fate." He said we should have resisted the KGB at the first. And I'm trying to say to you, the longer we wait, the harder it will be to stand. Now is the time to stand. Now is the time to wake up as a church, as a nation, as a community. Now is the time for Christ to be elevated, we lift Him high. We love God with all of our heart and our neighbors ourselves. But friend, it's time for us to turn this thing around. If we're going to get it turned around, now is the time. This hadn't been much of an evangelistic sermon tonight. I wanted to take a victory lap this week. A victory lap. And what do you mean a victory lap? We baptized 43 people Sunday. You know, and that's hallelujah. And that glory goes to you. It goes completely to you. And to the Lord, of course. Because you brought folks in. You've brought your friends and your family in. And told them about Jesus. They've heard the Bible taught. And the Lord has brought them in. And I pray that He keeps doing that over and over again. But tonight I wanted to begin to prepare our hearts for what I see is a radical change in our world coming. A time of persecution. What do you do? How do we survive? How do we live? What is our ethic in this time as we move? Sunday morning I'm going to be talking about, therefore, present your bodies living sacrifices, holy and acceptable unto God, a reasonable act of worship. And we're going to be into some familiar territories, but we're going to look at the ethic of being a Christian, and we're going to think about it being in this difficult time. Pray with me. Father,